Professor Ruth R. Wisse is the Martin Peretz Professor of Yiddish and Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. Born in Czernowitz and raised in Montreal, she was the first professor to introduce courses in Yiddish literature at McGill University, where she helped found the Jewish Studies Department in the late 1960s. She's the author of The Modern Jewish Canon, A Journey Through Language and Culture, which won a National Jewish Book Award. Her other books include Jews and Power, A Little Love in Big Manhattan, about two Yiddish poets in America, as well as a number of works and anthologies of Yiddish poetry and prose in translation. Professor Wisse is here this evening to discuss her provocative new book, No Joke, Making Jewish Humor, which recounts the long history of Jewish humor in its varying forms from Heinrich Heine to YouTube. Please join me in welcoming the one and only Ruth Wisse to the JCCSF.
Well, it's a very special occasion for me to be here on Stephanie's turf. This JCC has acquired quite a reputation, I think largely thanks to her and the kind of programming and the liveliness of this center. And I thank you all for coming here and being interested in this subject. So I think maybe the best place to begin is where I begin the book, and where I actually began thinking of writing this book. It arises to some extent out of a course that I give on the comic tradition in Jewish culture. But there was an incident that actually triggered it, and it is this. One evening I was speaking at a synagogue, and when I finished the talk, a man came over to me and he said very generously, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm going to give you a gift. And the gift was a brand new joke. And you know, if you're into this business, you know that new jokes are really, really tough to find. As you'll see probably this evening, that I'll see some of you nodding, oh, I know that one, I know that punchline. So, but this was new. And so the next morning when I was back in the building where Jewish Studies is housed, and I was collecting my mail, I ran into two of my colleagues who were also there. And I said, I couldn't help myself. I said, do I have a gift for you? And I told them this, which was then brand new. Since then, many people have stolen it. So it doesn't have that freshness any longer. But I told them this. 4 Europeans go hiking in the mountains together, and they get terribly lost, and they run out of all their food, and they run out of all their water. And the Englishman says, I'm so thirsty, I must have tea. And the Frenchman says, I'm so thirsty, I must have wine. And the German says, I'm so thirsty, I must have beer. And the Jew says, I'm so thirsty, I must have diabetes. So, okay. So, not so old, maybe, okay. So this was really a terrific moment. I'm not a great joke teller, and usually I'm the butt of jokes. So I had a moment of great pleasure. And also, it tells you something about telling a joke of that kind. It kind of creates a moment of, it creates a community of people who all get it. And that brings them together, and they release kind of anxiety that the joke builds up, because it's based on a kind of anxiety, and the Jew who is traveling in European company may have more occasion to be anxious than the others. And then it explodes that anxiety in this laughter, and it's kind of cathartic and wonderful. But my colleagues left the office, and I was about to leave the office, and the secretary stopped me. This is a woman whom I'd gotten to know quite well, not Jewish, but she was reading a lot of Jewish literature, so she had often asked me questions about it, and we had had discussions. She drew me aside, and she said, you know, I'm pretty disturbed about this. First of all, I didn't understand what was funny about the joke. Okay, that I could explain to her. And then she said, if you weren't Jewish, I would have thought it was anti-Semitic. Now, that kind of gives me pause because it troubled her. If I thought of it from her point of view, you know, she lives in a world of multiculturalism where it is not polite to stereotype people to begin with. So joking stereotypes, that's how it works. You have no time to go into details. You need something that identifies a mother-in-law as that. You know they don't all fit the stereotype, but that's what a mother-in-law does in a joke. And in Canada, you have the Newfies, right, who are supposed to be dumb. Now, of course, Newfoundlanders are not necessarily dumb, nor are Poles necessarily dumb, but that's the role they play in joking. What can you do? If you are politically correct, you don't engage in that kind of joking. So the stereotyping may have bothered her, but the bottom line was she thought it was anti-Semitic because she could not understand why Jews would laugh at something funny that exposed the Jew as being different in some way. It made her nervous. And joking at its best does make people uncomfortable, makes them a little bit uncomfortable. Now, this moment really appealed to me and interested me because one of my favorite books is Sigmund Freud's Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious. And it is a dense book. It really is tries to figure out the theory of humor. What makes us laugh? What are the techniques of joking? What is the function of joking? But in the course of the book, Freud has to bring examples, and almost all the examples that he brings are from Jewish humor. The large bulk of them are from Jewish humor, and they're excellent, excellent. It's as if it were almost a compendium of joking. Now, he's not interested in the Jewish aspect, but at some point, because he's brought so many examples from Jewish humor, he feels the need to say something about that, and so he has this sentence, incidentally, I do not know whether there are many instances of another people making fun to such a degree of its own character. And this became a very famous, often quoted sentence by people who studied Jewish humor, incidentally. Now, it's that incidentally that got me. It was incidental to him and his concerns in writing the book, but it became really central to my interest in it. You know, why is it? And how is it that Jews make fun to such a degree of their own humor, of their own nature, sorry. And in fact, there are students of comedy who thought, wait a minute, I want to test this out. So they went, for example, one scholar went to look at Scottish humor and found that the Scots make fun to a great degree of their own nature. And there are other ethnic groups who do that. But even this scholar who did this study had to admit that the intensity of Jewish self-mockery and humor is at a level that really is not approached in the same way by other minorities. So this really raises the question of a people that in the modern period certainly begins to make fun of its own nature. And this continues to the present day. Some of the jokes that Freud brings have their counterpart in modern versions. For example, this one, a flight to Israel in late December is about to land. This is your captain speaking. This is the culmination of El Al Flight 761, and we welcome you to Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the plane is at a complete standstill and the seatbelt signs have been turned off. And to those of you who are still seated, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I have to say, I can begin to see why people become comedians, because there's a great pleasure in this activity. You see how it makes fun of the Jewish, El Al Flight you know, some Jewish captain is going to tell a Jewish, you know, bunch of passengers what to do, when to get up, when to sit down. So it draws attention to the fact that Jews have no manners, that they don't listen to authority, and so on and so forth. It does make fun of the Jew's own nature, but as Freud points out in his analysis of similar kinds of jokes, it does something else as well. First of all, he says, and this is interesting, he says it shows you the democratic nature of the Jewish community, the fact that they don't listen to authority. I mean, there's a democratizing element to that. And it occurred to me that, you know, if you read something like the book Startup Nation, what is the point that Startup Nation makes? It tries to account for the fact that Israel has become one of the most dynamic, innovative countries in the world. I mean, extraordinarily out of proportion to the population. And why? Because people think out of the box, because they don't necessarily listen to authority, because they look. So the same elements that create this humor of making fun of the fact that you don't listen and that you go your own way is a plus as well as a minus. So the humor cuts both ways. Yeah, it's self-mockery, but it's self-mockery with a kind of pride in it as well. And the humor itself becomes a source of pride. Look at how funny this is, and look at how much fun we're having, laughing at our own humor. So my book deals a little bit with this. And rather than go all over the place, what I thought I would do is focus on just one theme or one subject of humor that is obviously going to be very, very prominent in Jewish humor, and that is the relation of Jews to non-Jews, to the Gentiles among whom they live. And a lot of joking about this encounter in many of its forms. So one of the things that you find, of course, are a lot of jokes about violence done to Jews. And the stereotype there is that the Gentile is the violent one, and the Jews are the innocents and the ones who are just trying to get along, right? They depend on the head, they don't depend on muscle, and the jokes usually work along those themes. But they have all kinds of twists. So there's a Yiddish joke that must come from around the end of the 19th century. Two Jews are in a wagon, and they are driving along a dirt road, and the horse stops on the road because suddenly he sees there's a boulder, a big rock in the middle of the road. So the two Jews sit there in the wagon, and they talk about what should we do, talk about the issue, and so forth. And then from the other side comes a wagon with two peasants in it, and the peasant wagon also stops in front of the boulder. And the two peasants get out, and they push the rock out of the road and proceed on their way. So one Jew says to the other, "That's Goyish thinking for you, always with force." So a little subtler, right, as this. So now the violence is there as the undercurrent of this. There's goyim for you, always with force. But who is it directed at? It's directed in this twisted way at oneself, with the realization that, you know what, there are times when a little bit of muscle, a little bit of action would be in order, as opposed to the Jewish way of dealing with things, which is always ratiocination and always trying to figure things out. So subtle variations on the subject of joking. So I think, as Stephanie said, my book tries to begin somewhere, and it begins in when Jews become noted for their humor. In other words, the connection between Jews and humor is not necessarily obvious, but in the modern period, there does begin to be an association made, both by Jews themselves and by others, as being a people that is attracted to humor, that is good at humor, that relies on humor, and so forth. And I think that this begins most spectacularly with Heinrich Heine in Germany. Heine's dates are 1797 to 1856. And some people have been really surprised by this aspect of what I deal with, because they know Heine, and in fact, most Germans certainly know Heine best as one of the great German lyric romantic poets. In fact, Heine's poetry is so beautiful and so wonderful that over 75 musicians have set it to music. And his song, his poem that was set to music, Die Lorelei, became so well known in Germany that when Hitler outlawed music of Jews, and by Jewish composers and by Jewish writers, they had to declare Die Lorelei a folk song, because it was impossible to take it out of the repertoire. So this is Heine the romantic. The other side of Heine is the wit, making fun of his own romanticism, making fun of his own attraction to idealism and to beauty and to these soft lyrical verses. Now, Heine converted to Christianity. He did so in the way that many, many Jews of his time did, and certainly many Jews of his circle did. He did so to get ahead. He thought he would get a professorship as a result of his conversion. He didn't get the professorship, but he was stuck with the conversion. And he became very bitter at his own expense. And he's the one who coined this description of conversion. He said that conversion was a ticket of entry or a passport to European culture. And this became really famous. What is conversion? Conversion is your ticket of entry, the passport, the ticket of entry to European culture. Now, if you think about the brilliance of this formulation, it cuts in so many ways. What kind of culture is it that is going to ask people to convert as a ticket of entry, number one? Second of all, what kind of religion is it that is being used in this way as a commodity for getting ahead, for getting into the European? And then, what about the Jews who pay this ticket so cheaply, who are so prepared to pay it? It is a devastating comment, I think, and it's a comment that, as I say, is devastating because you hardly know where the pressure point falls most, on which of these three entities that make up this idea. So, conversion, Jews and Christians, conversion, a big subject of European Jewish humor. You might ask, what happened to those jokes about conversion? Well, they're not likely to be popular in America because America has all kinds of other issues relating to Jews and acculturation and assimilation, many jokes about that, but not so many about conversion, for the simple reason that Jews don't have to convert. All you have to do, as I sometimes say, is move to Denver. And you can pass. I know people who do it effortlessly, and no one cares. And there's no stigma attached to it, so it's not the same thing. But these jokes about conversion were interesting. So you have 4 Jewish converts are discussing their conversion, and one says, I converted because I was falsely accused of a crime, and I was going to be sent to prison for a very long time, and I was told that if I converted, there wouldn't be any sentence against me, and so of course I converted. The other one says, my case is very different. My parents were ultra-religious. They were so ferociously religious, I couldn't stand it any longer. I converted to spite them. The third one says, wow, I converted out of love. I fell in love with a Christian woman, and I really wanted to marry her, and the only way I could get to marry her was to convert, and I converted because of that. The fourth one says, hey, I am unlike you entirely. I converted out of conviction. I converted out of the conviction that Christianity is a religion of a higher order. Oh, please, say the others, tell it to the Goyim. Right? So lots of jokes of this kind. Again, building up this reality of the anxiety that really thousands of Jews were converting to Christianity. It was a real subject and something, a real sore point. You take this sore point, you acknowledge it, that these 4 Jews are there, they're all converts, they all take it for granted that that's what you do, but the one who has done it out of faith, that you can't tolerate. So the joke really twists it up entirely and turns conversion into an anti-conversion joke, right? One of the wonderful things that happens when you write a book like this is that people send you stories, and they sometimes send you jokes. And I have to say that very few of these jokes are jokes that I have not heard before, because after all, if you're in the business of writing a book about Jewish humor, you're supposed to be familiar with what's out there. But every once in a while you get something that is really unexpected entirely. And so I got this one amazing letter, part of which I would like to share with you. And of course, I asked my correspondent whether it would be all right to share it with audiences, and he gave me the permission to do so. So he writes me as follows. In 1938, my father was one of a large group of Polish Jews in Germany who were sent temporarily to the border town of Zbonjin. Now, I don't know whether you know this, but in 1938, the Poles did not want the Jews who were being sent out of Western Europe, and Germany in particular. They didn't want those Jews returning to Poland. And so they said that these Jews had to have special passports. They had to have visas and passports to re-enter the country of which they were citizens. And they were all stopped temporarily in Zbonjin, in this place. So his father and his two brothers, young men at the time, were being shipped to this place in a long forced march. This was still 1938, though, not yet the killing period. So during this march, they were approached by an SS officer, and the SS officer taunted them, and he said, "The problem with you Jews is that you have no culture." To which my father answered, "We have no culture? When you were swinging in the trees, we were already homosexuals." And he goes on to think of, what impression this must have made. So, you see how this works. You expect, when you were swinging from the trees, we were already studying the Talmud. We were already Homo sapiens. But you don't expect him to one-up the ante, because, of course, one has to be very civilized, hyper-civilized, really, to become a homosexual and to have a society that tolerates homosexuality, which, of course, Nazi society did not. So this terrific comeback. Now, this is humor about Jews and Gentiles and hostile Gentiles that is aggressive in return for the aggression being done to them. Now, Jewish humor, as I try to show in the book, goes where the Jews go, does what the Jews do. That may sound obvious to you, but it isn't necessarily obvious. You have humor that grows out of the condition of the living condition of the Jews. So when Jews find themselves by the millions under the totalitarian horrors of Hitler and of Stalin, you have a tremendous fund of humor emerging from these two situations. And here was something that I found interesting. There are a lot of collections of jokes under Stalin and a smaller collection of jokes under Hitler, but also considerable. And these Jewish jokes are interchangeable. In other words, they obviously moved from one punitive system to another punitive system, and it's impossible to figure out, I can't figure out, whether they moved from east to west or west to east. There's a lot of argument among historians as to whether the concentration camp culture really began in Russia and moved to Germany, or whether it began in Germany and really moved to Russia. That's for historians to figure out. But in the humor situation, you find the same joke in both sets of books. So here's one of them. You can see the circumstances here. So two acquaintances meet on the street. "It's good to see you back," says the first. "I hear that conditions in the concentration camp are terrible." "Not at all," says the second. "We were treated wonderfully. They wake us at 7:30 in the morning. Breakfast with choice of coffee or cocoa is followed by sports, free time for reading, then a plentiful lunch and rest period, games or a stroll, dinner, the main meal of the day with conversation, later entertainment, sometimes a movie." The first man is incredulous. "Really?" he says. "The lies they tell. I recently ran into Klein, who told me horror stories about being in the place." "That's why he's back there," says the second. Now this begins to be interesting. You don't find it funny. It's hilarious. I mean, why is it not hilarious? This is a joke which tells you that the dangers, it's a joke that tells the truth by telling you that you dare not tell the truth. And joking is a truth-telling device of a kind. It tells truths that you're not allowed to tell otherwise. Now, this is a very sophisticated joke because it tells you the joke of people who were not allowed to tell the truth, and then twists it around so that you are laughing at the condition of in which you find yourself. And this was the condition within which Jews find themselves. But here's something that tells us something about joking, too. You see, the secretary did not understand the joke, Jews making fun of themselves. "I must have diabetes." But when we're not familiar with the situation, when the anxieties of a situation are no longer ours, Jewish humor is not even comprehensible to other Jews. So we can't think that there's this phenomenon out there, this encompassing Jewish humor that any Jew would get. Not at all. I could tell you yeshiva jokes, which you would not understand if you had not attended a yeshiva, and if you didn't know Hebrew well enough, and if you did not know Talmud well enough. You could tell jokes about other situations that you would not find funny at all. And so when we're thinking of Jewish humor, I think that we have to recognize that it is the circumstances within which we find ourselves that create the humor, allow it to go one direction or another. And if we're not in that situation, it's not so funny. So coming up into our own sphere and period, there was a time when most Jews in America were immigrants, or of the immigrant generation. And so you had in the 1930s, the New Yorker ran a series of funny stories by Leonard Q. Ross. And they were then collected in a book, The Education of Hyman Kaplan. Some of you might remember this. Funny. Very funny, about a Jewish immigrant and other immigrants who are going to night school. And of course, all the jokes turn on the fact of how creatively they mangle the language. They mangle the syntax, they mangle the spelling, everything is wrong. Mary had a little lamb, its fleas were white as snow, right? And things of that kind, hilarious. Now, years pass, the Jews are no longer immigrants. This same man, Leonard Q. Ross, emerges now under his own name, Leo Roston, and he gives us the joys of Yiddish, where he takes the Yiddish language and he creates this in the form of a dictionary, and he gives you one Yiddish word after another, Yiddish terms that have become popular in English, and they're all defined in a joking way. What chutzpah is, ha ha ha, is funny, and what davening is funny in its own way. Everything is explained here through humor. This is a little different. This is taking your culture not mangling English culture, but this is taking Yiddish culture and presenting it to the world. I don't know how you feel about this. I mean, one can feel very ambivalent about it. On the one hand, saying, look at this wonderful culture we have. Isn't it a joy, the joys of Yiddish? On the other hand, it's really saying, look at how funny we are. Look at how innocently funny we are. And partly as a consequence of things like the joys of Yiddish, when you are in the field of Yiddish and you're doing serious work in Yiddish, as students do and as scholars in the field do, and when you know the richness of Yiddish culture, it's really quite disturbing sometimes that people associate Yiddish with humor. They think the language is funny. And I don't know whether this has happened to you, but very often, if you are in company and people can be talking about something serious and they use a Yiddish word, ha ha ha, you know, it's as if it's the punchline of a joke. So on the one hand, the charm of making fun of one's own tradition and of one's own affection for what is humorous in one's culture, and on the other hand, really something a little bit different and less, maybe a little bit less attractive. Anyway, one more, and perhaps the edgiest thing to say about the humor of Jews and non-Jews in the American context. I would say that one of the figures most notoriously associated with it, there's so many comedians, there's so many things that one could talk about here, but Philip Roth is the person who has exploited this really at the highest level of creativity, I would say, the humor in particular. And it's a very cutting humor. Now, his first really comic novel was Portnoy's Complaint, written in the form of chapters. Each chapter, Portnoy is lying on the psychiatrist's couch, and he's telling the story of really how he became Alexander Portnoy, this guy who can never get beyond adolescence, who is always a sexual predator. And if I asked people, what do you think this book is most about? I think most people would say it's most about sex, because he's always pursuing girls and so on. That's really what it became notorious for. Well, rereading it, one discovers that the most, and I say, sort of aggressive part of it is not so much about sex at all, but it does have to do with Jews living in a non-Jewish environment. I'll just quote you one little section of it when Alexander Portnoy is making his first conquest, first time, of course, with a girl by the name of Bubbles Girardi, a good Italian girl, and he's trying to seduce her. And in the process of seducing her, when he looks up, he sees a picture of Jesus floating up to heaven in a pink nightgown, tacked up over the sink of this home. And this is how Portnoy describes it. The Jews I despise for their narrow-mindedness, their self-righteousness, the incredibly bizarre sense that these cavemen who are my parents and relatives have somehow gotten of their superiority. But when it comes to tawdriness and cheapness, to beliefs that would shame even a gorilla, you simply cannot top the goyim. What kind of base and brainless schmucks are these people to worship somebody who, number one, never existed, and number two, if he did, looking as he does in that picture, was without a doubt the pansy of Palestine. So, pretty vicious, I would say, right? And in a way, like Jackie Mason and like comedians who go that route, one of the ways in which he gets away with it is to begin with the Jews, right? Jews are X, Y, Z, so all right, he's making fun of you, so you can't protest if the humor then goes in the other direction and gets the other guy as well. But this is interesting that Philip Roth takes the gloves off, because he's living in a context of freedom, and he knows that nothing's going to happen to him. And what's more, it was interesting, the reaction to that book. People of the older generation, Gershon Scholem, Maurice Sirkin, very intelligent people, were appalled by this book. They said it was like Goebbels. They said Goebbels accused Jews of being predators against non-Jewish women. And now what are they going to think? They're going to think that that's the case. Well, they were living in another universe. If Philip Roth had worried about what would happen to the Jews under Goebbels, he could not have been so free and easy. He knew America. He knew that, you could do this kind of thing. You could go with this kind of aggression, that life had changed, and so the humor was much raunchier, was much rawer, much more aggressive in this way. Okay, now that is just one, so what I've done here is to sort of tease out just one set of jokes that have to do with Jews and non-Jews. And I will probably leave it more or less at that, but I did want to say that the question is sometimes put, rightly so, is there anything innate? Is there anything innate in the connection between Jews and humor? You know, I've given jokes which really arise from sociological situations, but is there anything in the Jewish DNA that goes all the way back that really means that Jews are essentially associated with humor? And I would say that you can make out a very strong case for that. And the people who do make out a case for it usually begin in the same place. They begin very early on in the book of Genesis, when Sarah is told that she will have a child. Sarah is way beyond childbearing age. And so the text tells us, therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? So Joseph Epstein, who does a lot of work with Jewish humor, says, you see, we did not have to wait for Philip Roth to get humor about erectile dysfunction, right? And it invites that kind of reading in a modern context. On the other hand, I take this a little bit more seriously, and I take humor very seriously, actually, because I think it is very serious at root. You can see what's happening in that laughter. On the one hand, the divine promise, you are going to have a child. And this is living within a context of believing divine promise. On the other hand, the evidence of biology, the evidence of your own experience. Which of these two are you going to go with? Now that is humor. That is where humor grows from. Incongruities, paradoxes, things which don't fit. And one of the ways that you put these two things together that don't fit is through humor. So centuries later, millennia later, you get Sholem Aleichem presenting his great character, Tevye the dairyman, who prays every day, and he says the words of the prayer, but he gives them his own interpretation. Thou hast chosen us from among the nations. Why did you have to pick on the Jews? Right? God will provide, if only he provides until he provides. This point-counterpoint, this faith skepticism, this being able to hold two things together. And what happens, alas, in modern Jewish life sometimes, is that when you let go of the one, that is to say, if you're no longer living as a community of faith, then that whole level of humor disappears, because then you don't have to hold this paradox together any longer. You've given up what made it paradoxical to begin with. So the real tension, I would say, of being able to sustain these two things, faith and skepticism, determinism and free will, the two things that come together and that twist at each other. These two things are very hard to reconcile. In fact, they cannot always be reconciled, except through a joke, through humor. And at this, Jews have become very proficient, and I think this is one of the real talents that Jews have developed as a people, and that is creating this kind of paradoxical, incongruity humor. So I'll leave it at that and be glad to answer any questions.
So before we start questions, just a reminder to fill out those slips. We're going to announce a winner at the end of the Q&A. Questions?
Okay, I think we have one up front here.
I'm having trouble understanding your analysis about the joke about diabetes. I always had heard that and told it as I'm thirsty. The other people say, I must enjoy myself. I'm thirsty, I want wine. I'm thirsty. Where the Jew says, I'm thirsty, and it ends with a worry, an anxiety. And now hearing your interpretation, I'm having a hard time. I wonder if you could say more about that it has to do with the anxiety of the Jew being amongst non-Jews.
Look, one is free to interpret any way one wants. I mean, we agree that it's funny. So technically, if you're looking at Freud's kind of analysis, technically it works in the following way. You have three people using the word must have in a certain way. I must have. And must have means I must possess. And then the fourth one uses the verb in a different way. I must have as having an illness. So he uses the verb differently. So that's what really twists the joke and turns it in a different direction. But the main thing is that, of course, the three are dealing with something concrete. It's not so much pleasurable, it's just that they need the drink. They're dealing with a concrete situation. What does it mean to say I must have diabetes in this situation? You're looking so much deeper than the causality, than the obvious causality, right? So it's again a joke about the level of Jewish anxiety, the level of Jewish thinking that is different from others. And ultimately it makes the point that in some way or other, Jews don't fit in that society. And the joke makes you enjoy the fact that you don't fit. I mean, in the situation, you don't fit. That's what bothered the secretary, right? That the Jews in this joke don't fit. But from the Jewish point of view, making a joke about it means that you're enjoying the fact that you like the fact that you don't fit.
It seems like it's one of a class of jokes that make fun of Jews as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Next question over here on this side.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know if it's unique, but it seems to me Jewish humor is much more self-deprecatory than, say, Irish humor, Italian humor, or what have you. I don't think there's such a thing as German humor necessarily. But what is it about the Jews that is so self-deprecatory?
Well, the many things. You can say that since you're going to be deprecated by others, you might as well get there first. You can say it could be anything you can do, I can do better. You think you can make fun of me? Huh, watch what I can do. It's that. And it is, to go deeper into it, it's not all self-deprecatory. There are all kinds of humor. I mean, I just took one kind of thread of humor. But I think that Jews are a self-accountable people. Jewish civilization is different from other civilizations in the sense that to the degree that Jews hold themselves accountable, they have to prove themselves to God because they entered into a contractual agreement with God and they are answerable to God. And so you have this Jewish, the fact of Jews standing before God, know before whom you stand, you're self-accountable. It's just a move from self-accountability to making fun of that self-accountability. So I think that there is something in there, but there's the other side too. For example, this is a kind of joke that comes from the Talmud into a modern form. You have 5 rabbis arguing a point of law, and 4 are elderly, the other one is young. The 4 elderly rabbis all hold to one opinion. The young rabbi holds to an opposite opinion. And they are adamant. They argue and they argue, and they cannot come to any agreement. And the argument gets more and more and more strenuous until the walls of the building begin to shake and to tremble, and a voice comes from above and says, "The young rabbi is right." So one of the elderly rabbis looks up and says, "Okay, so now it's 4-2. So that's not self-deprecatory, you see. That's already this balance of faith and skepticism.
Okay, next question.
Sure.
Next question's in the back here.
Okay, great.
In your joke regarding the 2 Jews versus the 2 peasants and the boulder in the road,
Yeah.
it is also a feature of Jewish humor and of Jewish survival never to think of violence or the use of force firsthand, because you might be tempted to use it and you would then suffer the consequences.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's, Stephanie mentioned that one of the first book I wrote was based on my thesis, which is The Schlemiel as Modern Hero. And there I try to I found that this is really one of the things that one tries to do, to take, I mean, for example, jokes out of the First World War. A Jew gets lost on the border in the First World War between the warring nations, and suddenly the searchlight shines on him, and the border guard says, "Stop or I'll shoot." And the Jew says, "Are you crazy? Can't you see this is a human being?" So you don't find these jokes do not appeal to any of you. He says in Yiddish, "Bist mishuge, das ist nicht das dogeter Mensch." In other words, your point to the Jew, it is inconceivable that someone would shoot because you're crossing a line? Are you nuts? I mean, I'm a person. I mean, this is inconceivable, right? But who is the joke on? The person who's telling the joke knows very well what it is to be stopped by a border guard, right? And knows that maybe one should know something in that situation. So it makes a kind of moral hero out of the Jew in that situation. And frankly, when I was writing that book and when I'm writing this book, I find a surfeit of that kind of thinking a little distressing. Up to a point, yes, but as that joke about that you allude to says, there are times when getting out and using a bit of muscle is very much called for, and one can recognize that.
Next question is right here in the middle.
Sure, okay.
I just wanted to know what realm black humor plays in Jewish humor, because there's a wide variety of humor in
Sure.
Judaism. So it seems like some of these jokes really fall into that dark side.
Yeah, well, that's true. You know, a lot of the book has to do with, for example, the rise of Jewish comedy in America at the Borscht Belt. And, you know, there are tons of comedians who make a living with just jokes. So jokes that are, you know, universal and quite innocent. What are the 3 words that a woman does not want to hear when she's making love? Honey, I'm home. So not black humor. You would agree, right? Not black humor at all. On the other hand, I say at least once and more in this book that at the heart of my book lies a sentence, which is a joke, which is a witty saying that comes out of the Warsaw Ghetto. And in the Warsaw Ghetto, the historian Emanuel Ringelblum created a group of researchers. He knew that the situation in which he found himself was totally unique. and that it had to be recorded. It had to be recorded as accurately and as absolutely as possible. So he trained researchers to go out into the ghetto and to research every conceivable aspect of life. And so they did, and one of the researchers was charged with trying to find out what are people saying, what expressions, what words, what new words are being created. And there's a record of this. 2/3 of that material managed to survive the war and was rescued, and much of it is in Yad Vashem, some of it's still in Poland. Well, one of the things recorded, one of the sentences recorded in answer to your question is, God forbid that this war should last as long as we are able to endure it. Very black. You would expect the sentence to say, God forbid that this war should last longer than we are able to endure it, because the idea is you want to outlive it. But this wit says, God forbid that this war should last as long as we are able to endure it, meaning that if this war is terrible, Jewish endurance is in some sense even more terrible and more extreme, right? Really, it's at the level of some kind of greatness, it's a very profound, and it comes out of the situation.
Okay, next question over here.
I have not exactly a question, but I have a comment, and that is we've been talking about the nature of self-deprecatory jokes, and I think that what I remember, and maybe it's generational or maybe it's born in America or something, but what I remember is jokes that are really more self-congratulatory and making yourself out to be better or superior or one-up or at the least have the last word.
Yeah, well, these jokes.
Do you have any analysis of that or any take on that?
I agree. I mean, I think that my point was that even the self-deprecatory humor has the last word. That's what you do when you have a joke. You've got the last word. And I think that too, answering an earlier question, is that one of the ways of coping is to have the last word. For example, in Sholem Aleichem's humor, he was the greatest humorist of the Jews, I think, most profound humorist of the Jews. In Sholem Aleichem, very often, you have a character who cannot control the situation. The only way he can control the situation is by turning it into humor. And so his interpretation of the situation becomes his way of controlling. And that is, I wouldn't say necessarily self-congratulatory. It's even more than self-congratulatory. It's a form of using humor as a really strong, not just a survival technique, but as a reaffirmation of moral confidence. I regain my moral confidence by having the last word in this particular way. So yeah, I mean, I think that there is that strain too, and I would say that self-deprecation and self-congratulation are sometimes very closely entwined.
Next question over here on the side.
Sure.
So it's the telling of a joke as well as the joke, obviously. And as a native San Franciscan, I've always thought that somehow Jewish humor was so wrapped up with New York in the telling of jokes. I'd like you to comment on that. And I wonder where you're from.
Not from New York. You learn, my son introduced me not long ago at an evening that was, launch for this book, and he said, in our family, I would have expected anyone in our family to write a book about humor. My older brother, his older brother, who is a very witty guy, my father, that's my husband, who loves joking and does it wonderfully. He says, but my mother? He says, she was the straight man. So, part of it is timing, you know, and as in that joke about the guy who was asked, ask me how I became the most famous comedian in Poland. So you say, how did you become the timing, you know? It's a skill that you develop. And actually, my husband coached me on some of these. He said, you better pause a little bit before you go, you say this.
And the question about the regional, the New York.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know whether this is true. San Francisco now has comedy clubs, and the whole, if I'm not mistaken, the whole culture of how Jews celebrate Christmas, didn't that start in San Francisco? I think this has become like a whole trope of Jewish existence in America, how Jews celebrate Christmas. And they do it through joking. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is where that started, that whole idea that that's what we do on Christmas, is we go to comedy clubs and we do joking. So West Coast isn't doing too badly.
Okay. Next question over here.
I'm just curious. Chaplin is not Jewish, but it sounds to me like, it looks to me that he's a very Jewish humor. There's an explanation for that?
Well, no. I mean, it's a nebbish humor. It's the humor of the little man. Yeah. I mean, I don't know whether. Jews do not have a monopoly on humor, certainly, and Chaplin is a good example. Steve Martin is a good example of a great humorist who's not Jewish, right? And what about Cosby, who uses many of the same tropes? So it isn't exclusive to Jews in any way, but the point is that I think the point is that it's the predominance of this factor. It's the degree to which one begins to rely on it. And let me say that things have reached a very strange pass. Because I don't know whether you are familiar with the Pew Report, right? But the Pew Report has given us really strange information that when asked what is essential to being a Jew, 42% of American Jews said a sense of humor is essential, as opposed to 19% who said some form of Jewish observance. Now, I hope you're laughing because I think this is the point at which Jews become a joke. It's not they're the ones who are making the joke, but when they think that, when twice as many Jews think that it is essential to have a sense of humor as it is to engage in Jewish observance, and that is the essential part of Judaism, we've become a joke. And not in the way that I think is particularly admirable.
Next question right here in front.
Thank you. I'm just curious what you think about Mel Brooks. I mean, Mel Brooks is the result of a lot of association with other comedians, but the way he composed things like Blazing Saddles, and like his saying, how do people deal with the Holocaust? Well, if you can laugh at the Germans, laugh at the Nazis as to where they make a joke out of what they were doing, a joke not out of the atrocities, but about this rigidity of non-imagination and make a comedy out of it. And I think he did it brilliantly, from what I've seen.
Well, that's interesting, and this is a question that you're raising beyond Mel Brooks about taste in humor. Taste in humor is a matter of taste. There's nothing more to be said. Some people find a joke tasteless, others find it brilliant. Part of what Mel Brooks did is to develop this in-joke humor. As Mr. Krasny was saying today, that you have this phenomenon of Woody Allen in Love and Death saying when he meets this woman, he says, I'm pleased to meet this famous Miaskite. Now, the only people who would know what this means are Jews who know that a Miaskite is an ugly woman. And so what he's really saying, I'm pleased to meet this ugly woman, completely above the heads of everybody in the audience, except the one or two people who might get it. And Mel Brooks does that in Blazing Saddles, you know, where the Indians are speaking Yiddish and so on, in-jokes, this kind of in-joke. So that can be charming, and like an added level of humor for those who are in the know. But the question of taste can be very painful. Let me give you my own experience. In the book, I quote a joke, and I once spoke not at an evening about joking, but at an evening about something else, and I told this joke. And I was reproached by a very dignified gentleman who was very upset. And it is a joke. Nobody here asked me about Israeli humor, but the last chapter of my book deals with Jewish humor in Israel. And my claim is that although people thought Jewish humor wouldn't last in Israel, it's alive and well in Israel as well. And one of the reasons is because a lot of the conditions that created Jewish humor, the anxieties that created Jewish humor are flourishing, alas, in Israel. So you have this story of there's a suicide bombing in a cafe in Tel Aviv. Now, that's a beginning of so many Jewish jokes. There was a pogrom in X. Jokes abound that begin with this. There was a pogrom in X. Would you think this is funny? But that's like a classic line of a joke. So this is now transferred into, there was a suicide bombing in Tel Aviv, in a cafe in Tel Aviv, a very well-known cafe in Tel Aviv. And the woman in Jerusalem hears about this on the radio, and she is horrified because her family lives very close to this cafe. So she picks up the phone and calls her cousin, and her cousin answers the phone, and she says, "Are you all right?" And the cousin says, "Yes, thankfully we are all right." And the Jerusalem woman says, "And what about Anat, who is the teenager who hung out in that cafe?" And the woman says, "Oh, Anat is fine. Anat is in Auschwitz." The person who told me this joke said that people were on the floor laughing in Israel about this joke. Now, do you understand what it is at all? You understand because teenagers go on these trips like a March of the Living. The classes of teenagers, they all go to visit the camps in Poland, right? So Anat is Anat is safe. She's in Auschwitz. So what a twist, right? Because of course Israel is supposed to be the place that you went to escape from the fate of Auschwitz, and now the whole thing is so bitterly turned on its head that a girl can be particularly safe because she is in Auschwitz. Again, black, I would say, as a humor arising from the situation. So I think we call it this, yeah, just one.
Okay, we're going to take one last question, but before we do, let me just get that basket. We're going to pick a winner. Shake it up. Let's be dramatic.
You will, yes.
Okay. Sandy Schlumberger? Sandy Schlumberger? Sandy?
No?
Okay. Well, I don't know if Sandy Schlumberger's here, but I'm going to email Sandy.
Okay.
Okay. We have Sandy Schlumberger. Okay. Let's take one last question.
Okay, over here.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you very much, because not only did I appreciate the jokes in themselves, but you gave me an understanding of why I find funny what I find funny. But the thing that was important to me is the part that you came to explained that it's one's background and understanding that the reason you're able to relate to the joke in the first place is because you understand something about the situation. That, in part, I think, is the answer to the woman that questioned about New York City. And having grown up there and spent many, many years there, I thought the whole world was Jewish. What happens is all the times going up to the Catskills and all and hearing the Jewish comedians, they were talking to their own kind and to the people that had the same experiences. So that's what basically built up the idea of Jews and humor.
Yes, I mean, I think that it built up the idea of Jews and humor. And also, you have to think of the conditions that these people were invited to work in the Catskill hotels, of which there were several hundred, as waiters, as bus boys, as pool boys, and so forth. But they were expected to be funny. And this was a mode of entertaining the guests. And then they became professional comedians out of it because they were already a form of professionals. So that has to do with something else, and that is the professionalization of Jewish comedy. In other words, there's Jewish comedy like in the Warsaw Ghetto and the joke books that were collected at the end of the 19th century. You have really compendia of humor in Yiddish, in Hebrew. People went around collecting these wonderful stories of wit, stories of Chelm, other folk tales, comic tales. But that was not commercial. It was just a folk humor. But then in America, and also in Poland, and also in Russia and other places, and certainly in Germany, you began to have humor develop as a profession. Comedians would stand up in front of audiences and be paid to amuse people through humor. Jews developed this in the Borscht Belt was as one of the, I think a movie is called The School for Comedy, is it? There's a new movie about the Borscht Belt, a documentary, and it makes this point. Radio starts at that point, and of course radio is looking for people who are proficient in telling jokes, and radio picks up these people, and so and then television goes from there. It picks up these people who've become adept at radio, and before you know it, 75% of the working people in comedy, 75% or more by the 1970s, are Jews in America. And that has to do not just with joke telling, but with the professionalization of Jewish comedy. Thank you very much. Thank you.